Stepdad locked the door. My pulse spiked. 60-year-old George turned, eyes dark, voice sharp. There's only one way to test us. I froze on the couch. Alone. Mom gone. His boots thudded closer. He sat, too near. Hand grazed my knee. Then my thigh. Heat crept up. We're good together, he hissed. Closer. Tighter. His breath hit my neck. My phone dropped. Tension snapped. Something big was coming. One wrong move, and everything would explode. What he'd do next would change it all. I'm Emily, 22 years old, and this is what happened between me and my stepdad, George, in our house in Sacramento. It started on a Tuesday night in March 2024, when I was sitting on the couch in the living room, scrolling through my phone after work. Mom had just left for her shift at the grocery store, her car pulling out of the driveway at 6:30 p.m., leaving the house quiet except for the fridge humming in the kitchen. I was still in my coffee shop uniform, black jeans and a faded green t-shirt, since I'd gotten home an hour earlier from my part-time job. George, who's 60, turned from the front door after locking it, his boots scuffing the hardwood floor, and said, "There's only one way to test us." I looked up from my phone, surprised, because he'd never said anything like that in the 4 years he'd been around. He was wearing his usual flannel shirt, hands in his pockets, and his gray hair was messy from messing with an old radio earlier. I asked what he meant, keeping it light, thinking he might be joking or starting a random talk about fixing something in the house. He didn't answer right away, just walked over to the recliner across from me and sat down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The lamp next to him was on, and he looked at me steadily, his face serious. He said we needed to talk about trust, about how we'd been living together since I was 17 and should understand each other better by now. I set my phone down on the cushion next to me, waiting for him to explain, because this wasn't his usual grumbling about the news or Mom's late hours. He kept talking, saying Mom was always at work, leaving just the two of us in the house most of the time. I shifted on the couch, crossing my legs, and asked him why he was bringing this up now. He leaned back in the recliner, folding his arms, and said it was something he'd been thinking about for a while. He mentioned how I'd grown up, how I wasn't a kid anymore, and how that changed things between us. I nodded, still not sure where he was going, because it sounded like he was just stating facts. He got up then, walked to the kitchen, and grabbed a glass of water from the sink, taking a sip before coming back to sit down. He set the glass on the coffee table between us and said we should do something to prove we could rely on each other. I asked what he had in mind, figuring maybe he meant a project like cleaning out the garage or fixing the back fence. He shook his head and said it wasn't about chores, but about something deeper, something personal. I stayed quiet, letting him talk, because I didn't know what to say to that. He leaned forward again, resting his hands on his knees, and said we'd figure it out together over the next few days. I picked up my phone, checked the time, 7:15 p.m., and told him I had to finish some stuff for work tomorrow. He nodded, got up, and walked down the hall to the spare room where he kept his radios, leaving me on the couch wondering what he was really getting at. That was the first night things started shifting, and it wasn't until later that I realized what he meant. The next day was Wednesday, March 2024, and I woke up around 8 a.m. to get ready for my shift at the coffee shop. Mom was still asleep after her late shift, her bedroom door closed down the hall, and George was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee when I walked in. I grabbed a granola bar from the pantry and filled a water bottle, planning to head out soon. He looked up from his mug and asked if I'd thought about what he said last night about trust. I paused by the counter, unwrapping my breakfast, and told him I wasn't sure what he wanted me to think about since he hadn't explained much. He set his coffee down, leaned back in the chair, and said it was about us being honest with each other, about not hiding things. I took a bite of the granola bar and asked what he meant by hiding things, because I didn't have any secrets I was keeping from him. He stood up, walked to the sink to rinse his mug, and said it wasn't about secrets yet, but about building something stronger between us. I finished my water bottle, grabbed my keys from the counter, and told him I had to get to work, but we could talk later. He nodded, drying his hands on a towel, and said he'd be home all day if I wanted to pick this up after my shift. I left the house at 8:30 a.m., drove to the coffee shop, and worked my usual hours, pouring drinks and wiping counters until 3 p.m. The whole time, I kept thinking about what George was trying to say, but it still didn't make sense. When I got home, Mom was awake, sitting on the couch watching TV, and George was in the backyard messing with some old lawn chairs he'd been meaning to fix. I dropped my bag by the door, went to the kitchen for a snack, and saw Mom glance over, asking how my day was. I told her it was fine, just busy, and grabbed an apple before heading to my room to change. Around 5 p.m., Mom started getting ready for her shift, pulling on her work jacket and packing her lunch in the kitchen. George came inside, washed his hands at the sink, and sat down at the table while I scrolled through my phone on the couch. Mom left at 5:45 p.m., her car backing out as usual, and the house went quiet again. George got up, locked the front door like the night before, and walked over to where I was sitting. He stood by the armrest and said we should start figuring out what he meant by trust now that Mom was gone. I put my phone down and asked him to just tell me what he wanted, because I didn't like guessing. He sat on the recliner again, resting his hands on his knees, and said it was about spending time together, doing things Mom didn't need to know about. I asked what kind of things, and he said stuff like going for drives or working on projects, just the two of us. I told him that didn't sound like a big deal, and he agreed, but said it was a start. He got up, went to the fridge, pulled out a soda, and offered me one, which I took. We sat there drinking for a bit, not saying much, until he suggested we drive to the hardware store tomorrow after my shift to pick up some tools. I said sure, figuring it was harmless, and he nodded, heading back to his radio room. That was how it began picking up speed. I woke up and got ready for my coffee shop shift, grabbing a yogurt from the fridge while George ate toast in the kitchen. He asked if I was still good to go to the hardware store later, and I said yes, after work. He nodded, wiped his hands on his jeans, and said he'd be ready. I finished eating, tossed the container in the trash, and left for the shop. Work was the usual routine, making drinks, ringing up customers, cleaning tables, then I drove home. When I walked in, Mom was at the kitchen table with tea, scrolling through her phone, and George was in the living room watching a car show. I dropped my bag, changed into a hoodie and sneakers, and came back out. Mom asked if I had plans, and I told her I was going with George to the hardware store. She said to be careful and went back to her phone. George grabbed his keys, told Mom we'd be back soon, and we walked out to his truck. It was an old blue pickup, scratched up from years of use, and I got in the passenger seat while he started it. We drove to the hardware store 15 minutes away, the radio playing some classic rock station he liked. I asked what he needed to buy, and he said a few tools for a project he wanted us to work on together. I nodded, looking out the window as we passed strip malls and gas stations. At the store, we parked and went inside, walking through aisles of screws, paint cans, and power tools. He picked up a hammer, a set of wrenches, and some nails, handing me the wrenches to carry. I followed him to the checkout, where he paid with cash, and we loaded the stuff into the truck bed. On the drive back, he turned the radio down and said this was what he meant by trust, doing things together, keeping it between us. I asked why Mom couldn't know, and he said it wasn't about hiding, just about having something for ourselves. I held the bag of nails in my lap, thinking it over, and said it still didn't feel like a big deal. He agreed, but said it would build into something more over time. When we got home, Mom was still at the table, and we walked in with the bags. She asked what we got, and George said just some tools for the shed. I set the wrenches on the counter and went to the couch, pulling out my phone. Mom finished her tea, started getting ready for work, and left soon after, the front door clicking shut behind her. George locked it, then came over to where I was sitting. He said we should start the project tomorrow, maybe fix up the old patio table in the backyard. I said sure, figuring it was just something to do, and he went to the kitchen, grabbed a soda, and handed me one. We sat there drinking, not talking much, until he suggested we move the table into the garage tonight so it'd be ready. I put my phone down, followed him outside, and we carried the wobbly metal table across the yard. It was heavy, and I held one side while he took the other, setting it down by the garage workbench. He wiped his hands on his shirt and said this was a good start. I nodded, went back inside, and sat on the couch again, wondering what he was really trying to build with all this. That's how it kept moving forward. The next day, I got up and went to work at the coffee shop like usual, leaving the house while Mom slept and George stayed behind. Work was busy with a rush of customers ordering iced coffees and pastries, so I didn't think much about the patio table or George until I got home. When I walked in, Mom was in the kitchen making a sandwich, and George was out in the garage, the door open so I could see him sorting tools on the workbench. I dropped my bag by the couch, changed into a t-shirt and shorts, and grabbed a water from the fridge. Mom asked how work was, and I said it was fine, just tiring. She nodded, finished her sandwich, and started packing her bag for her shift. George came inside, wiping sweat off his forehead with his sleeve, and said he'd been setting up for us to work on the table. I told him I'd be out there after Mom left, and he went back to the garage. Mom headed out soon after, her car pulling away, and George locked the front door again. He walked over to me on the couch and said we should get started. I put my phone down, followed him to the garage, and saw the patio table sitting there with the tools laid out, hammer, wrenches, nails, and a can of spray paint. He handed me the hammer and said we'd start by fixing the loose legs. I took it, knelt by one side of the table, and started tapping nails into the wobbly joints while he worked on the other side with a wrench. We didn't talk much, just focused on tightening everything up, the sound of metal clanking filling the garage. After a while, he stood back, looked at the table, and said it was already better. I agreed, setting the hammer down, and he grabbed the spray paint, shaking the can. He said we should paint it next, make it look new, and handed me a rag to wipe down the surface. I cleaned off the dust and dirt while he opened the garage door wider for ventilation. He started spraying the table black, the paint hissing out uneven strokes, and told me to watch how he did it so I could take over. I stood next to him, holding the rag, and he passed me the can after a few minutes. I took it, started painting the other side, and he stepped back, arms crossed, watching me work. When I finished, the table was shiny and wet, and he said we'd let it dry overnight. I set the can down, and we moved the table to a corner of the garage to sit. He grabbed 2 folding chairs from the wall, set them up, and we sat there looking at the table. He said this was what he meant of us working together, making something without Mom in the middle. I asked why it mattered so much, and he said it was about having our own thing, something separate. I nodded, not pushing it, and he got up, went inside, and came back with 2 sodas from the fridge. He handed me one, sat back down, and we drank in the garage, the paint fumes still lingering. After a bit, he said we should do more projects, maybe fix the shed next. I said okay, figuring it was just more of the same, and we folded the chairs, went back inside, and I sat on the couch while he headed to his radio room. That's how it kept going, step by step. The next day was Saturday, and I didn't have work, so I slept in until Mom left for her shift around noon. When I got up, the house was quiet, and George was already outside in the backyard, standing by the shed with a toolbox. I ate a bowl of cereal in the kitchen, watching him through the window as he pulled old boards off the shed side. After I finished, I changed into an old shirt and jeans, grabbed a water bottle, and went out to see what he was doing. He looked over when I walked up and said we should fix the shed today since we had time. I asked what needed doing, and he pointed to the rotting wood on one wall and a rusty hinge on the door. He handed me a crowbar and said I could start prying off the bad boards while he worked on the hinge. I took the crowbar, wedged it under a splintered plank, and started pulling, the nails creaking as they came loose. George grabbed a screwdriver and a can of oil, loosening the hinge and squirting it until it stopped squeaking. We worked like that for a while, me stacking the old wood in a pile and him fixing the door so it swung open smoothly. He went to the garage, came back with new boards and a saw, and we measured the gaps on the shed wall together. He held the wood steady while I sawed, cutting pieces to fit, and then we nailed them in place with the hammer from the patio table project. The shed started looking solid again, and he said we were a good team. After the wood was up, he grabbed a can of stain from the toolbox and 2 brushes, handing me one. We started painting the new boards, spreading the dark brown color over the wood, and he said this was better than he expected. I kept brushing, covering the last piece, and we stepped back to check it out. The shed looked almost new, and he said Mom wouldn't even notice unless we told her. I asked why we wouldn't, and he said it was ours, not hers, and that's how it should stay. I shrugged, wiping my hands on my jeans, and he put the tools back in the box. We went inside, and he locked the front door, even though it was still daylight. He said we should clean up and relax, so I washed my hands in the kitchen sink while he grabbed sodas from the fridge. He handed me one, and we sat on the couch, the TV off, just drinking and looking at the backyard through the window. He said we'd done a lot in a few days, more than most people would, and it proved we could handle things together. I nodded, taking a sip, and he leaned back, resting his arm on the couch. He said we should keep this going, maybe do something bigger next time, and I asked what he had in mind. He didn't answer right away, just looked at me, then said we'd figure it out soon. He got up, went to the garage, and came back with a small radio he'd been fixing, setting it on the coffee table. He plugged it in, turned it on, and static crackled before music came through. He sat back down, closer this time, and said we deserved to rest after all that work. I stayed where I was, holding my soda, and we listened to the radio for a while, the shed outside standing as proof of whatever this was becoming. That's how it built up to the next step. It was Sunday, and I didn't have work again, so I got up late while Mom was already gone for her shift. George was in the living room when I walked in, sitting on the recliner with the radio from yesterday playing low on the coffee table. I grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen and sat on the couch, still in my pajamas, sweatpants, and a loose t-shirt. He looked over and said we should do something different today, something to top off everything we've been working on. I asked what he meant, and he said we should stay inside, just the two of us, and see where it takes us. I set my glass down, not sure what he was getting at, but nodded because it didn't sound like much. He got up, locked the front door, and came back to sit on the couch this time, closer than before, about a foot away. He turned the radio off, leaving the room quiet, and said we built a lot together, trust, he called it, and now we should test it for real. I asked how, and he said by being alone, really alone, without any projects or distractions. He shifted closer, his knee almost touching mine, and said we didn't need to say anything to Mom about this either. I stayed still, holding my water, and he reached over, resting his hand on the cushion between us. He said we'd earned this after all the work, and I should just relax with him. I put my glass on the table, watching his hand, and he moved it closer, brushing the edge of my sweatpants. He said we could sit here, just like this, and let it feel right. I didn't move, and he slid over until his leg pressed against mine, his hand now on my knee, light but steady. He looked at me, not saying anything, and I could hear my own breathing in the silence. He leaned in a little, his shoulder touching mine, and said we didn't need to do more than this, just feel it out. His fingers tightened on my knee, and he shifted so his arm was along the back of the couch, behind my shoulders. I stayed where I was, and he moved his hand up my leg, stopping at my thigh, resting there like it was normal. He said this was the test, seeing if we could handle being this close, and I didn't pull away. He leaned closer, his face near my shoulder, and his other hand came up to touch my arm, sliding down to my wrist. He held it there, his thumb pressing lightly, and said we were good together, better than he thought. The room felt smaller, and he shifted again, his chest almost against my side, his breath warm near my neck. He said we could stop any time, but he didn't want to, and his hand on my thigh moved an inch higher. I sat on the couch, not moving, and George kept his hand on my thigh, just above my knee, and said it was a test to see if we could handle this kind of intimacy. He looked at me without pulling away and slowly squeezed his fingers together, leaving my palm lying heavier than before. I didn't pull away, just sat there, feeling the warmth of his hand through the fabric of my pants. He moved closer, his knee now resting against mine, and told me we were good together, better than he thought. His other hand went up to my shoulder, his fingers sliding down the sleeve of my t-shirt, lingering there, lightly stroking the fabric. He leaned in, his shoulder pressed against mine, and I felt the warmth of his body as he said we could stop, but he didn't want to. He shifted even closer, his chest now touching my side, and his hand on my hip moved higher, almost to the edge of my pant leg, but stopped, just laying there, hot and still. His breath came closer, I could feel it against my neck, and he ran the fingers of his other hand from my shoulder down my arm to my elbow, lingering there, squeezing lightly. It was as if the room shrank, the air thicker, and he leaned in more, his face now a few inches from mine, his eyes looking directly at me. The hand on his hip moved a little higher, his fingers trembling slightly, and he said this was our moment, that we deserved it. He stretched his arm behind my back, resting it on the back of the couch, almost hugging me, and his body was so close now that I could feel his heat through my t-shirt. Suddenly the front door clicked. Mom had come back for the phone. She opened the door and walked in, her bag falling with a clatter as she saw George almost lying on top of me, with his hand on my thigh and the other behind my back. She screamed without giving us a second thought and rushed forward, snatching the bag off her shoulder and hurling it at George. He jumped up, tripped over the table, and yelled that it wasn't what she thought it was, but Mom was already yelling, calling him a pervert and demanding he get out of the house. I jumped up, trying to say nothing had happened, but she grabbed a pillow off the couch and launched it at me, yelling at me to shut up because I had seen everything with my own eyes. George backed up against the wall, and Mom rushed over to him, shoving him in the chest and yelling that she was going to divorce him tomorrow and call the police. He grabbed her arms trying to stop her, but she lashed out and punched him in the face, leaving a red mark. I yelled for them to stop, but Mom turned on me and threw my water glass against the floor and the glass shattered on the hardwood floor. She said I was just as guilty and ran out of the house, slamming the door so hard the frame fell off the wall. George kicked the table, said that was the end of it, and left for the garage, and I stayed among the shards, realizing that everything was just beginning.